Xin Chao, welcome back to the Build It Certified Facilitator and Master Teacher Training. I'm Dr. Kathy Weigel, Project Director for the Build It program and Associate Director for Curricular Innovation in the Ira A. Fulton Schools of Engineering at Arizona State University. Today we have with us Dr. Scott Danielson, Associate Professor of the Polytechnic School. He will be talking with us today about STEM education and some of the changes that will be needed for the future of Vietnam.
Glad to be here.
So today we want to talk a little bit about how STEM education is performing and whether or not you think STEM education, we're doing a good job with STEM education.
Well, basically I would say no. And I think when I say no, it's based on a multitude of factors, and that no probably extends to Vietnam as well as the United States. Although the United States may be able to better cope with some of the deficiencies, if you will. But I think if you look at the types of students we have in our programs, particularly women, say, in STEM programs, it's much lower than the representation of women in the population, so why should that be? So I think that's a failing. I also think in many cases, particularly in engineering, our students may not be given good professional skill development, or in the AUN QA speak, generic skills, but things like teamwork, communication, those sorts of things. So I think there is more we can do, and we can do a better job.
What types of changes do you think we need to make in our approach to education in STEM? How can we do a better job?
Well, I think before we look at how we actually make the changes, I think we need to understand what's driving those changes. And I think that while Vietnam is a different country and a different culture than the United States, I think many of these drivers are the same for education. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to kind of understand those drivers for change and be able to react to those in a proactive way and not in a defensive way. Okay. So some of those, I think, go to things like global challenges, and Vietnam in particular is being impacted by some of these global challenges, or grand challenges as sometimes they're referred to. But things like the environment, particularly say drought in the Mekong Delta, saltwater intrusion, climate change writ larger even, with various plant species, animal species being impacted. So that we have the environmental aspect of things, we have issues around energy, delivering energy, designing systems that will generate energy that are not harmful to the environment. To the north of Vietnam, of course, many people know the difficulties that China faces with their rather dramatic environmental struggles and the impacts of that on the people. So we need fresh approaches to solve these problems, and again that goes back to a wider diversity of minds within STEM education, and having our students have a better skill set when they graduate to be better able to cope with the problems that we all face.
So are you saying as undergraduates that our students will be able to tackle those challenges while they're in their academic program?
Well, I think our undergraduates, when they graduate, become the front line in helping to solve those problems. There's an old saying about we can't use the same type of thinking to solve the problems that thinking created. We need new style of thinking, different approaches to solving problems. And the creativity of our youth is legendary, both in Vietnam and in the U.S., and so we need to position them to be well equipped to take advantage of that innate creativity. The other issue that's around, particularly in Vietnam, and of course the United States is having a lot of debate about this now as well, is globalization, and globalization of STEM education. The ASEAN economic integration allows students to move back and forth between countries and societies. And so our students need to be able to take advantage of that newfound freedom and be able to leverage their skill set, as well as universities need to be able to attract students from these different countries. So changing the way we educate, improving the efficiency of that education and the impact of that education in our students really will make a difference both to the country and to the individual educational institutions. I also think there are some increased professional expectations. Certainly international companies working in Vietnam have very specific needs, and they want Vietnamese graduates, Vietnamese employees to be able to handle those. And so whether that's communication skills, whether that's the ability to work on teams, whether that's to be able to not wait for instruction, but to take initiative and own their job, the problems that they are facing. These are things that may be not traditional in Vietnam, but are ways that STEM education can change to help those new graduates be better able to work in those international companies, which are very desirable employment. And the country wants those companies to be here to provide economic benefit to the country. And so certainly we as higher education employees, as lecturers, faculty, want to be able to help our graduates accomplish that. So there's been a lot of work done about how to improve. And so I think one of the things that we should spend a little bit of time on is some of those specifics, but some of the studies, primarily US-centric, have really pointed the way for us, and I think we can take advantage of those.
So do you have some data about some of those studies to share?
Well, yes. Mostly about, well, I have some data about strengths,
Okay.
but I also have some data about weaknesses. And I think while these data are US-centric, we may want to focus on them because they give us ideas of how we need to change. And again, I think some of those extend also to Vietnam. And I think we have to be realistic and have to face the fact that our perception as educators may well not be the same perception that the public has about our programs.
Well, I was actually reading, there was a recent Gallup poll, and it showed that 98% of the lead academic officers in the US, that would be the provosts or like the vice rectors, they actually felt that they were very effective in preparing their students for workforce. But then when you compared that with the general public, it was only 13%, and then the C-level executives, the high-level executives of a company, they only 11% felt that they were preparing their graduates effectively for the workforce. So what do you think explains that disparity? How can education think they're doing a good job, and then the general public and the corporations completely disagree?
Well, and I've, in a project I worked in called Vision 2030 with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, we ran into that same phenomena. So it's not a surprise to me to hear you quote those statistics. When we surveyed, as a part of that project, over 1,000 industry supervisors of new graduates, they basically, and these are the data I was referring to earlier, had some significant issues or pointed out significant weaknesses of the new graduates. I think it's because educators tend to live in their little world, and they do what they've been doing. And they teach in ways that they were taught, and they often, and I've unfortunately found this to be particularly true in Vietnam, don't talk necessarily to industry. And so I think it's something that we need to do. The US has been catching up in this now, and other countries as well, but Vietnam needs to start listening to industry in a more formal and organized way. Because I think the data are there, it's important to listen to industry and understand their data. So I mentioned that Vision 2030 and some of what we found there. And, we surveyed not just the supervisors, but also those early graduates. So they had been working for 0 to 5 years after graduation. Then we also interviewed about 80 academic leaders, typically department chairs, program leaders. And again, we saw that same disparity. The program leaders thought, oh, we're doing fine and our students are okay on this. And here's where we really need to work on developing, say, new curriculum. And then we heard the industry and the new graduates. The new graduates and the industry supervisors were very similar. They had very similar ideas for the most part, but dramatically different from the educators.
Were there certain areas where you felt like they were out of sync, or where they disagreed, or was it across all the different areas?
Well, there was certainly some areas of agreement, but for instance, new cutting-edge technology was a concern or an issue. At least the academic leaders felt they needed to do more development in that. the industry supervisors basically could care less. They didn't worry about having students knowing the most current cutting-edge nanotechnology. They were more interested in, do they have the basic fundamentals, some of which, again, were these professional skills that I touched on a little earlier. So I think that it's important to have a sense of where that weakness is, so that as we think about what we do and how to improve them, how to improve our programs, that we take these data into account. For instance, the number one weakness that we found, and this was for U.S. graduates, but and in an engineering area, mechanical engineering, as I mentioned, but I think it's also true for probably any STEM field that you might think about, is the graduates did not have any practical experience in how things are made and work. Now, of course, that's very important for engineering, but if I think about a science field or an environmental science field, for instance, they have to have an understanding of how things work. Now, they maybe get a theoretical understanding of how an environmental system works on the big scale, but if they have to go out and take data for experiments on climate change, for instance, they have to have an understanding how sensors work, how to use those sensors, how to manipulate the data that comes from those sensors. And I'm not sure our programs are giving them that. So that practical experience is something that's important. Communication skills. And in Vietnam, they face the additional challenge of being able to be conversant in 2 languages, because most international employers want their Vietnamese to be able to speak English. It is the language that spans the ASEAN countries. So if they're going to have to work with somebody from Laos or Cambodia or Indonesia, English is going to be the common language.
And that's something we've heard time and time again from our corporate partners as well as our university partners.
Yeah. So none of this is new or terribly hard to recognize, but it is important to both listen and then start to make changes. And of course, this whole facilitator training master teacher workshop series that we're embarking on is going to try and help to do that. So we'll be talking about any number of things that can help that. Another area that we struggle with in the United States as well, and I think it will be true in Vietnam, is the area of codes and standards. And again, there are codes and standards for most engineering fields, but also the STEM disciplines, and helping students understand that when they leave this artificial environment of an academic program and go into the real world, quote unquote, industry, solving real problems in their communities and in their companies, they're going to have an understanding of these codes and standards.
Well, codes and standards change, and they change over time. So then how will the faculty figure out what they need to teach?
Well, I think that's one of the ways you get that is by talking to your constituents, your stakeholders, by talking to the places where your graduates go. So if I'm an environmental science program, where do my graduates go? I need to go talk to them, either the new graduates, as I mentioned earlier, or the supervisors, if you will, and find out what tools do my students need to have, and then figure out how to put them into your program. If it's the professional skills, then that's much more under our control, because we can configure the way we teach, and I know that we'll be talking about this again later, the way we teach so that our students can have better skill set when it comes to the areas like communication, teamwork, conflict resolution, all of those different things.
Okay. So you've talked a lot about talking to industry and getting a lot of input from industry. But I've also heard the faculty say that they perceive themselves as the experts in those content areas. So how can they balance all of those demands from industry? How can you possibly teach all of the special software, the technology, the systems that each school wants? It's a lot for them to build in and balance in their program.
And again, the Vietnamese complaint in that area would be no different than in the United States. At ASU, you would hear the same sorts of things. And certainly there are barriers to change. But yet, how we teach, as much as what we teach, is important. So we need to think about how we configure the study program so that the students have the right sorts of experiences. And so there are changes I think we can make, and we can't necessarily make them all at once. It does end up being a incremental process, but we do need to make sure that we work at and in a thoughtful way of developing those professional skills of our students. So we have to configure educational experiences again so that they get to see communication, teamwork, conflict resolution, project management. They need to experience those things as students. And that is something the faculty can control because it has to do with how they actually teach their courses.
So are you saying we need to add courses in those topic areas into our programs?
No. I mean, it would be nice if you could, but you do not have to. One thing you could think about adding would be project courses where the students experience projects in teams, because that's much more like what they will see in industry or will see in business when they leave the school. So having them do projects in their courses, and I know that some Vietnamese educators do this, so it's not like no one does, but I also know that there are many classes taught just via strictly lecture. Students don't get a chance to interact with each other and develop these skills. So it's, again, more about changing what we already do as compared to implementing a whole new program of study.
So it sounds like you're talking about integrating these things into our existing
Yeah.
programs.
And there are modes of learning that support that. Again, we will be talking about more of those, or the faculty as they go through this training program. We'll be hearing more about that. But there are ways we can do that, and in ways that help us break through these barriers to change that we have. And we've already touched on one of the, probably the biggest barrier, it was at least the largest barrier noted by our U.S. respondents to the Vision 2030 work, but the biggest thing was just faculty time. Our faculty are busy doing many things. How do they find time to do these things? And so that's why I think that if faculty can implement in a course they are already teaching something that is new, different, will engage the students more, that will help address some of these issues, fit within their current workload, but also dramatically improve the students' interest and engagement in their courses.
So what other challenges do you see that we need to be aware of as we try to implement some of these changes?
I think, and one of them is what this program is all about, and what the HEAP program is about, which is essentially faculty knowledge. I mentioned earlier that when faculty teach the same way they were taught, they kind of think, well, it worked for me, so why shouldn't I continue to do it? But they need to realize or come to understand that there are different ways to teach that are actually proven to be more effective, and will help engage the students they have, but also potentially attract students that right now are not attracted to their program of study. So again, the idea of faculty not having to make a monumental change, of incremental change to what they do and how they teach, with that focus on trying to always work towards improving student skill set as required by their constituents, their industry, or the places they're going to go to work.
Well, Scott, I really want to thank you for joining us today. And it's really been helpful for us to see through Scott's comments and insight and the data that we've looked at a little bit about why we're here involved in this training and why we're trying to make these changes to our classroom and to higher education in Vietnam. So hopefully this will motivate you as you go forward and you begin to redevelop your coursework and your materials. So again, my thanks to Scott for joining us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to seeing you all again.